The chase and the unexpected rescue. The towering alien trees loomed like ancient giants around Taran as he sprinted through the dense undergrowth of the forest moon, the wet ground beneath his boots slippery from the recent rainfall. His body, drenched in sweat, was on the edge of exhaustion, but his mind pushed him forward, knowing that stopping meant certain death. The air was thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the low hum of distant wildlife filled the otherwise eerie silence. Taran's breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning his lungs. His pulse pounded in his temples, but it was the sound behind him, the unmistakable, deafening roar, that kept him running. The creature, whatever it was gaining on him. Every step of his sprint seemed to echo in the dense forest, and each second that passed felt like an eternity. His body screamed for rest, but his mind remained sharp with one single focus: survival. He had been sent here alone by the Galactic Survey Corps to gather atmospheric readings on an uncharted moon, a task that was supposed to be simple and uneventful. The moon had appeared like a blank slate on their scanners, perfectly hospitable, with no signs of dangerous fauna. But as soon as he had set foot on the surface, things had gone wrong. A screeching warning had erupted from his wrist comm, followed by the roar that sent ice through his veins. The survey mission had turned into a race against time. Taran glanced over his shoulder, his eyes catching the flicker of movement between the trees. The shadows were massive, shifting rapidly as something enormous stalked him through the darkened forest. The ground trembled with each footfall of the creature, and the trees around him creaked as if warning him to flee faster. He had no doubt that if it caught him, it would tear him apart without a second thought. His instincts screamed at him to find shelter, to hide, but the creature was too close. He couldn't risk being cornered. His only hope was to make it to the clearing where his ship awaited. The proximity sensors in his helmet had shown the path, the only clear route that led out of the dense woods. But even as he pushed himself harder, he knew he had little time. Taran leaped over a tangle of thick roots, the sharp branches of the alien flora scratching at his exposed skin. His clothes were torn from the frenzied dash, but he didn't feel the pain anymore. The fear, the adrenaline, it kept him moving, faster, harder. His breath was a steady rhythm of desperation, his heart racing with every moment that passed. The roar from behind him grew louder, a sound that seemed to reverberate through his bones. It wasn't a simple predator's growl. It was deep, guttural, full of malice and fury. Taran's mind raced as he remembered his training. This was no mere animal. It was a predator with intelligence, the kind of creature that hunted in packs, or perhaps one that had developed an unsettlingly personal vendetta against him. He heard it then, the thundering crash of heavy footsteps, each one closer, quicker. Taran's pulse spiked as the sound reverberated through the trees, shaking the ground beneath him. He could almost feel the creature's breath on his neck, its eyes locked onto him like prey. A jolt of panic hit him, and he pushed himself to the limit, his body protesting, but he forced his legs to move faster. The clearing was just ahead. His ship, barely visible under the dense canopy of the alien forest, sat waiting like a lifeline. He could see the faint glow of its running lights in the distance, offering a glimmer of hope, a momentary escape from the nightmare that was chasing him. Then, as if the forest itself decided to punish him for his hope, Taran's foot caught on an exposed root. He staggered, his body crashing to the ground in a painful roll. For a second, the world spun, and the fear in his chest threatened to swallow him whole. He quickly recovered, pushing himself up, but the impact had slowed him. His mind screamed for him to move faster, but his body was fighting against him, each breath harder than the last. The creature was closing in. He could hear the crushing force of its steps, feel its presence looming just behind him. Taran pushed through the pain, forcing himself back into the sprint, but then the ground beneath him seemed to tremble violently. A blast of hot air, followed by another spine-chilling roar, sent his heart into overdrive. He had to make it to the ship. He had no choice. As he burst into the clearing, The flood of relief that had washed over him was immediately replaced by shock. His eyes fell upon the sight before him, an impossible sight that froze him in his tracks. At the center of the clearing, tethered to a gnarled alien tree, was a humanoid figure, an alien girl, bound and chained. Her body was slender yet strong, her silver hair wild, glowing in the dim light, and her skin a smooth iridescent blue that shimmered under the harsh light of the ship's spotlight. Her delicate features were contorted in a mixture of terror and confusion, her luminous purple eyes wide in panic as she glanced back at the creature closing in. Taran's heart raced even faster as he took in the sight. His instincts screamed at him to help her. There was no time to think. He couldn't just leave her to face the creature. Without a second thought, he pushed forward, sprinting toward her despite the overwhelming danger. The girl's eyes locked with his as he approached, a mix of surprise and relief flashing in her gaze. "It's okay," Taran said breathlessly, his hands fumbling for the chains that bound her to the tree. "I'm here to help you." He had never seen anything like her before. She was unlike any species he had encountered during his years in the Survey Corps. Her delicate frame and the way her body shimmered in the light. Everything about her was otherworldly. And yet, her fear mirrored that of any sentient being caught in the grasp of imminent danger. He tugged desperately at the strange, glowing metal shackles that held her. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, intricate in design and seemingly impervious to his efforts. But as the creature's growls grew louder and its massive form appeared at the edge of the clearing, Taran's resolve hardened. He had to get her out. There was no other choice. Taran finally managed to free her from the tree, just as the beast let out another earth-shaking roar. But instead of retreating, the girl stood tall, looking up at him with wide, defiant eyes. Taran's breath caught. "Come on, we need to go now," he urged. But as he turned to pull her with him, he realized the gravity of the situation. Not only was he now running from an alien predator, but he was also carrying the weight of a life. Her life, in his hands. And from the look in her eyes, he knew one thing. This wasn't going to be a simple escape. The girl's life was tied to his now, and no matter what, he would not leave her behind. The tradition that bound them. Taran's chest heaved as he and the alien girl ran toward his ship. The heavy pounding of their footsteps reverberated through the clearing, drowning out the terrible roars that echoed behind them. He could hear the beast growling, its massive form crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground with each passing second. The trees trembled with each strike it made, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the creature's rage. He glanced at the girl as they ran. She was light on her feet, her slender frame agile despite the weight of her chains that still clung to her delicate wrists. Her purple eyes were wide with fear, but held an underlying strength, a determination that matched his own. Taran knew that she was no stranger to danger, but the predator that pursued them was unlike any creature he had ever faced. "We're almost there," Taran called, his voice filled with urgency. His ship was within reach now, a beacon of safety in the midst of this chaos. But even as they ran, the girl's feet seemed to falter slightly, as though she was struggling to keep up. Taran reached out and gripped her arm gently, urging her forward. Her skin felt warm to the touch, her body radiating a soft, almost ethereal glow beneath the harsh lights of the ship. "Don't stop," he urged. "We're almost there. Just keep going." But the girl didn't respond. She was focused, her eyes trained on the path ahead, but there was something else in her gaze, something distant, as if she were fighting against a tide of tradition, a force far greater than the immediate danger of the creature chasing them. Taran's mind raced. She was clearly not from this planet, and judging from her appearance, she was likely part of a different species entirely, an alien race with customs and laws he didn't understand. Yet here she was, vulnerable and bound by something deeper than the chains that held her wrists. He had seen this before, in other species that held on to their ancient traditions and beliefs, even when faced with life or death situations. What was it about her, about this moment, that felt like a collision of worlds? They reached the ship's hatch, and Taran quickly punched in the access code. The hatch swung open with a soft hiss, but before they could step inside, the ground shook violently beneath them. The monstrous creature had entered the clearing, its roar deafening now, shaking the trees and the very earth. Taran didn't wait. He pulled the girl into the ship, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He slammed the hatch shut behind them, securing the entrance just as the creature's claws scraped against the metal door. Taran didn't take a moment to catch his breath. He immediately moved to the controls, but his eyes kept drifting back to the girl who was standing near the ship's entrance, staring at the closed hatch with an unreadable expression. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, but there was something more to her than fear. She wasn't just a terrified being in need of protection. She was part of something much larger, something beyond the wild chase that had just transpired. Taran's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're safe. We'll be fine. Just give me a second to get us out of here." The girl didn't respond at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the hatch. It was as if she was waiting for something or someone. Taran didn't understand, but he had no time to question her now. The proximity sensors flashed, and a low hum filled the cockpit as the engines powered up. The ship slowly began to rise, its thrusters pushing against the gravity of the moon's surface. It was then that the girl spoke. "Why did you help me?" Her voice was soft, but filled with a quiet strength. It was a question that seemed simple, but Taran felt the weight of it. She was looking at him now, her purple eyes locked onto his with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. Taran hesitated, unsure of how to answer. His mind raced through the events of the past few minutes, but the truth felt complicated. The instinct to help her had been immediate, almost reflexive. But now, with the danger momentarily behind them, he couldn't ignore the questions that had started to form in his mind. Who was she? Why was she chained to that tree? And why had he felt so driven to rescue her? I don't know," Taran said quietly. "I couldn't just leave you there." The girl studied him, as though weighing his words. Her eyes softened slightly. And for a moment, the tension between them seemed to ease. But then, her expression grew serious again. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "By saving me, you have bound yourself to me by our tradition. You." She stopped herself, her gaze flickering down to the floor of the ship as if she were unsure whether she should continue. Taran's brow furrowed. "Bound to you? What do you mean?" "You've saved my life," she interrupted, her eyes flashing with an intensity that made Taran pause. "And now you must take responsibility for it. You are bound by our customs, by our tradition, and there is no escape from it." Taran stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the controls. "What are you talking about? I didn't ask for any of this. I just helped you." "I know," she said softly, her gaze never leaving him. "But by saving me, you have done more than just help. You have broken the rules, and now you must face the consequences." Taran's confusion deepened. What rules? What consequences? The girl's eyes softened, but there was a certain sadness in them, as though she understood the weight of what she was about to say. "In my culture, when someone saves another's life, they become responsible for them. A bond forms, a connection that cannot be undone. And..." She hesitated, biting her lower lip as if struggling with the weight of her next words. "According to our customs, you must now take my purity, as it is the only way to sever the debt." Taran stared at her, his heart racing. He had heard of strange traditions among alien species, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He had saved her life out of instinct, not out of some calculated move to entangle himself in an ancient alien custom. "What do you mean by that?" Taran asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You're saying that because I helped you, I'm now..." "What? Forced to take you?" The girl nodded solemnly. "That is how it is done in my culture. It is the only way to honor the debt, to respect the life you saved. It is a tradition that has existed for centuries, one that cannot be avoided. Taran's head spun. He had done nothing more than follow his instincts, and now, somehow, he had found himself caught in the traditions of an alien world. His mind raced with questions, but he was also aware of the severity of the situation. He couldn't deny what was being asked of him. This was no simple matter. It was a deeply ingrained cultural norm that carried immense weight. As the ship ascended into the stars, Taran felt the pull of destiny, the weight of the girl's tradition settling heavily upon him. He had no idea what the future held, or how far this strange, new bond would take him. But one thing was certain: his life was irrevocably changed. The course of his journey, and perhaps his entire existence, had just shifted in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The weight of tradition. Taran's mind raced as the ship ascended through the alien atmosphere, its engines humming steadily as they broke free from the moon's gravity. He didn't look back, but the image of the girl, the alien girl, bound by customs that were so different from anything he had ever known, haunted him. Her words echoed in his mind, growing louder with every passing second. "You must take my purity." He had saved her. That had been his only thought in that moment of terror, when the creature had been on their heels, its growls echoing like a death sentence in his ears. He had acted without thinking, driven by instinct, by compassion. But now, in the sterile silence of his ship's cockpit, the weight of the alien girl's culture hung over him like a storm cloud. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't asked for any of this. Taran's grip tightened on the ship's controls, but his mind wasn't focused on the trajectory or the course. His thoughts were consumed by her strange customs, her alien culture, and by the consequences of his actions. How could I have known? He thought bitterly. I was just helping her. That's all. The girl, sitting quietly beside him, her radiant purple eyes still filled with a combination of fear and resolve, seemed to sense his internal struggle. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the steady hum of the ship's systems. "I didn't ask for this," Taran said, his voice rough. He hadn't meant to speak aloud, but the words spilled out before he could stop them. "I didn't want any of this to happen." The girl's gaze never left him. Her face, though pale from fear, held a softness, a vulnerability that Taran hadn't noticed before. She was far from the powerful, untouchable being that her species' customs made her out to be. Beneath the surface, she was just as human as he was. She looked away, down at the floor of the ship for a moment, her lips pressed together in thought. "I know," she said quietly. "You didn't choose this. It's not something I wanted either." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "But it's the way it is. I didn't make these rules, and neither did you. But now we both have to live with the consequences." Taran's stomach twisted. He was a soldier, a man trained to face danger in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The weight of her tradition, of her culture, had just thrust him into a conflict he hadn't been prepared for. His chest felt tight with confusion and frustration. There was no way out. The laws of her people weren't negotiable. And now, it seemed, he was bound by them too. "So what now?" Taran asked, his voice strained. He met her gaze, searching for answers. "Am I supposed to just accept this? Do what you're asking of me?" The girl's eyes shimmered with something that almost looked like regret. She opened her mouth to speak but paused, as though searching for the right words. "I don't want to force you into anything," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted to put you in this position. But according to the customs of my people, once a life is saved in such a way, there is no escaping the bond that forms. It's part of our tradition, one that has been passed down through generations. It's the way we honor those who have helped us." Taran ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling up inside him. "I'm not from your world. I don't know your customs, and I don't know how to deal with this. This isn't just some honor ritual. You're asking me to." He stopped, his words faltering in his throat. "I know it's hard," the girl interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. But we have no choice. I'm not asking for something from you that you haven't already given. You saved my life. This is just the way it works." Taran looked away, his eyes narrowing as the enormity of her words sank in. His breath came quicker now, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to understand the intricacies of this alien culture. He didn't want this to be true. The very thought of it was overwhelming. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. There were no shortcuts. There was no easy way out. He had crossed a line he never even knew existed, and now he had to face the consequences of that choice. "So what happens now?" Taran asked again, his voice quieter this time, resigned. "If I don't do this, if I refuse, what happens to you? What happens to me?" The girl looked at him then, her face softening with a mix of sympathy and sadness. "If you refuse, the bond will not be broken, and I will remain bound to you, not just by the life you saved, but by the weight of my people's tradition. If you refuse, I'll become a slave to this debt for the rest of my life. It's not something I can avoid, no matter how much I wish I could." Taran's fists clenched. He had seen violence, had fought in battles on distant planets. But this was different. This was not about weapons or war. It was about life and death, about ancient customs that carried more weight than any weapon ever could. He had acted on impulse to save her, but now that instinct was turning into something far more complicated. "And if I accept?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just a simple decision. It was one that would change both of their lives forever. The girl's eyes flashed with something that seemed like hesitation, but she nodded slowly. "If you accept, we'll be bound by our traditions. You will have to claim me as your own, and in doing so, we both honor the life you saved. There is no turning back from that either." Taran's heart sank. He felt as though he had been backed into a corner with no way out. He didn't know this girl. He didn't understand her culture. But somehow, he had become part of it, whether he liked it or not. A long silence filled the cabin, the hum of the ship the only sound that filled the space. Taran stared out of the window, his thoughts a whirlwind. The vastness of space stretched before him, but all he could focus on was the weight of this decision, this bond. Finally, the girl spoke again, her voice small but resolute. "I know this is not what you expected, and I understand if you don't want to do this, but I have no choice, and neither do you." Taran closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly, the words bitter in his mouth. But he knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, he would have to live with the consequences of his choice. The ship continued its journey through the endless void of space, carrying with it the weight of two lives, bound together by the strangest and most unexpected of fates. Whatever the future held, Taran knew that this moment, this bond, would define everything that came after.